On the morning of December 9th, 1945, the most famous fighting general in America climbed into the back of a Cadillac to go hunting pheasant, and the young man who slid behind the wheel was 19 years old. 20 minutes later, a truck turned across the road, the two vehicles touched almost gently, and George Patton was thrown forward into a steel bar behind the driver's seat and broke his neck. The general died 12 days later. The teenager driving walked away without a scratch, and then spent the rest of his life as the boy who was driving when Patton died. His name was Woodring, and this is the weight he carried. Understand first what makes this story almost unbearable. The war was over. Patton had survived North Africa, Sicily, the breakout across France, the relief of Bastogne, thousands of miles of the most dangerous work on earth, every shell and mine and machine gun the enemy could throw, and he was killed, at last, by a low-speed collision on a quiet German road on a hunting trip in a car barely dented, 7 months after the guns fell silent. If the manner of his death was cruel to Patton, it was almost crueler to the 19-year-old holding the wheel, because the world would need someone to explain how a legend dies in a fender bender. Horace Woodring was born on a Kentucky farm in 1926, which made him 15 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked and barely old enough to enlist by the time the fighting ended. He never fired a shot in anger. By the strange arithmetic of the occupation army, this farm kid with a gift for driving was pulled out of the ranks and handed one of the most coveted and most nerve-wracking jobs in Europe: personal chauffeur to General George S. Patton. To understand the boy at the wheel, start with how a teenager ends up driving America's most volcanic general at all. By late 1945, the shooting war was memory and the occupation was routine, and Patton, restless and unhappy in peacetime, chafed at a desk command he did not want. He was already planning to fly home to the United States within days, perhaps for good. Around him his household ran on young enlisted men, and among them was Private First Class Woodring, 19, recently assigned as the general's driver. He was good at it. Patton, who terrified grown colonels, seems to have liked the quiet, capable farm boy, and Woodring later spoke of the general with a plain respect that never curdled, even after everything. On the morning of December 9th, the plan was simple and harmless. A day of pheasant hunting in the countryside near Mannheim to break the monotony. Patton in the back seat, his friend and Chief of Staff General Hobart Gay beside him, Woodring at the wheel of the big Cadillac's staff car, a hunting dog and gear along for the day. It was a Sunday. The roads were nearly empty. There was no urgency, no danger, nothing about the morning that should have earned a place in history. They set off through a landscape of bomb-scarred towns and quiet fields, 3 men and a dog, going hunting. At a railroad crossing on the edge of Mannheim, a 2.5-ton army truck, coming the other way, suddenly turned left across the Cadillac's path. Woodring had no time and nowhere to go. The two vehicles met almost slowly, metal folding against metal at low speed, the kind of collision that in 1,000 other cars ends with 2 drivers exchanging angry words. But Patton, unbraced in the back seat, was pitched forward and up, and his head and neck struck the steel frame of the partition behind the front seat. In an instant it was done. Gay was unhurt, Woodring was unhurt, and Patton could not move. What Patton said in the wreckage, and what he said in the days that followed about the boy who had been driving, is the heart of this story. And it is coming. Because the moment the news went out that George Patton lay paralyzed after a car crash, a search began for someone to hold responsible, and every arrow pointed at a 19-year-old private. The way that could have gone in the army of 1945 would have destroyed Woody Woodring's life before it started. That it did not is because of one man's insistence from a hospital bed. Keep that in mind as the general is carried away. Hold the brutal arithmetic. George Patton was 60 years old. He had commanded the Third Army across some 600 miles of enemy territory, liberated thousands of towns, and become, arguably, the most feared Allied general of the war, and he was felled at perhaps 10 or 15 miles an hour on a Sunday drive. The collision left the Cadillac drivable. It left 2 of the 3 men untouched. It broke the neck of the one man in the car whose survival the entire free world had taken for granted. And it placed the blame, in the first frantic hours, squarely on the shoulders of a teenager. Patton was conscious, pinned, unable to feel his body below the neck, bleeding from a scalp wound. The general who had roared across 2 continents lay still and clear-headed, and, by the accounts of those present, calm. He knew immediately how badly he was hurt. They eased him from the car and rushed him to the U.S. Army hospital at Heidelberg, where doctors confirmed the catastrophe. A broken neck, spinal cord damage, paralysis. For a man like Patton, a cavalryman, an athlete, a force of pure motion, it was a sentence more terrible than any battlefield wound. And still, in the middle of it, his thoughts turned to the boy who had been driving. As the investigation cranked to life, the pressure to assign fault was enormous, and the easiest target was obvious and defenseless, a 19-year-old private first class. But Patton would not have it. By the accounts that survive, the general made plain that Woodring was not to blame, that the accident was exactly that, an accident, a truck turning where it should not have. The Army's own inquiry cleared Woodring completely. No charges, no reprimand, no scapegoat. In perhaps his last act of command, from a hospital bed with a broken neck, George Patton shielded a teenager from the machinery of blame. It may be the most human thing the old warrior ever did. For 12 days Patton fought the only battle left to him, flat on his back in traction, his wife Beatrice flown in from the States to sit beside him. He joked grimly with the doctors. He seemed, for a few days, to rally, but a man of 60 with a shattered spine, in the medicine of 1945, had little chance, and on December 21st, an embolism stopped his heart. George S. Patton, who had told his men he intended to die with the last bullet of the last battle, died in a hospital bed of a car accident in peacetime and was buried among the fallen soldiers of his Third Army in Luxembourg, where he lies today. And Woody Woodring, cleared of all fault, 19 years old, walked out of December 1945 into the rest of his life carrying something no exoneration could lift. He had been at the wheel when Patton died. That sentence would follow him for 58 years. He had done nothing wrong. The general himself had said so, the army had said so, and none of it mattered to the simple, magnetic, unfair fact that the world found irresistible. Of all the millions of men who served, Woody Woodring was the one holding the wheel when the legend died. He went home to Kentucky and then to Michigan, and he mostly kept his silence. Think about the particular loneliness of it. He could not grieve the way others grieved, because to too many people he was not a mourner, but a suspect, or a curiosity, or a footnote in someone else's tragedy. Conspiracy theorists, then and for decades after, spun wild tales that Patton had been assassinated, that the crash was staged, that the young driver knew more than he told, ugly fantasies that made a quiet man's private burden a public target. Woodring answered them the same plain way all his life. It was an accident. A truck turned. He was driving. There was nothing more to it, and nothing anyone could do to bring the general back. Woody Woodring built an ordinary, decent American life in the long shadow of that one December morning. He left the army, worked, married, raised his family, and settled in the Detroit area, a private citizen who happened to be a permanent footnote in the biography of a national hero. For most of those years, he said little. He was not a man who traded on the connection or sold his story to the highest bidder. When historians and reporters found him, as they periodically did, He answered honestly and without drama, the same farm boy plainness Patton had liked, and then he went back to his life. In his later years, as the wartime generation began to pass and the interest in Patton never faded, Woodring spoke a little more to set the record straight against the conspiracy peddlers, if nothing else. Yes, he had been the driver. No, there was no plot. The truck turned, the general was thrown, and a young man's hands were on the wheel of history's most famous fender-bender. He spoke of Patton without bitterness, even with a kind of loyalty, the driver still protecting the general's memory decades after the general had, in his last days, protected him. It was a debt quietly repaid across a lifetime. His story leaves a question worth sitting with. We remember the generals, the men on the currency of history, and we forget almost entirely the young men whose ordinary hands were on the machinery around them, the drivers, the orderlies, the kid at the wheel. Woody Woodring did nothing wrong, and yet he carried a share of the weight of Patton's death for 58 years, simply because he was there. Is that fair, the way history assigns a young man a role in a tragedy he neither caused nor could prevent? Or is it just the price of proximity to greatness, that the legend's shadow falls longest on the smallest people standing nearest to him? Horace Lynn Woodring of Kentucky and Michigan, born on a farm in 1926, died in the Detroit area on November 2, 2003, at the age of 77, of heart failure. He was a husband and a father, a man of quiet decency, and for 58 years the keeper of a burden he never asked for and never deserved. He was the last man to drive George Patton, and by the general's own dying insistence, an innocent one. History gave him a footnote. He deserves a fuller line than that, the good young man who was cleared by the legend himself, and who carried the weight anyway, with grace. Here is what this story leaves behind. George Patton, who wanted so badly to fall at the head of his troops with the last shot of the last war, instead broke his neck at 10 miles an hour on a hunting trip and used nearly his last strength to make sure a teenager would not be destroyed for it. And that teenager, given his life back by the dying general, spent the next 58 years quietly guarding the truth of what happened and the memory of the man in the back seat. The great remember the great. But sometimes the truest measure of a great man is who he thought to protect on the way out. Patton thought of the boy. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served as a driver, an orderly, a mechanic, or in any of the quiet jobs beside the famous names of that war, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.